Welcome, everyone. We're going to get our program started. For those of you who have not had the opportunity to meet, I am Peggy Conway. I am your Director of Alumni and Constituent Engagement here at TCU Neeley. And I wanted to make sure I had a chance to introduce myself so that I can serve as your first point of contact when you have any questions or needs from Neeley. If I don't have answers for you, I can find the answers for you and make sure I get you in the right place. So please feel free to reach out to me at any point. We appreciate you joining us for today's Alumni Advantage series. These virtual sessions are just one of the ways that Neeley aspires to serve as a lifelong partner in your success. And so following today's session, we'll send you a follow-up email with information about more opportunities and events for alumni, plus a recording to today's session, which is my way of letting you know that the session today will be being recorded. And of course, we wouldn't be able to bring this session to you if it were not for the support of our sponsor, Jeff King, who is a Neeley alum himself and president of Northern Trust. So thank you very much, Northern Trust, for this opportunity. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to today's host and moderator, Dr. Mark Houston, who is Professor of Marketing and Associate Dean for Faculty and Research here at TCU Neeley. Mark?
Yeah, all right, Peggy, thank you so much for the introduction. And alumni, it's a thrill to be here with you today. Really glad that you could join us. Some of you I know through MBA courses over the years. Other of you I haven't had a chance to meet, but look forward to connecting with you through events like this. And next time you're on campus, please be sure to stop by. So a really interesting topic for today. It's a topic I think that maybe takes on some urgency that is not often there when we talk about the future. I think there are a lot of business topics that it's fun to kind of sit back and reflect on what the future might be like and what are the big changes, coming along. When we talk about the future of work and the future of teams, I think as we're all quite aware, there's been a recent global phenomenon that has brought this topic from the distant future into the here and now, the very near future at the minimum. And so we're pleased to see just the amount of interest in this. So many of you have joined us. I'm super pleased, though, to have a panel of two experts to share their thoughts on this topic, and they have a lot of things to share. Before I introduce them, I do want to mention that we would like this session to be fairly interactive, and we've got a lot of people joining from a lot of different places, and so just to keep things moving smoothly, I'd appreciate it if you would enter any questions that you have, just type them into the chat box. I'll be keeping an eye on it. Kaylin and Peggy will help me kind of keep an eye on questions as well, but we want to respond to the questions that you have. I'm serving as the moderator for this, and it's my pleasure to introduce the people who really know what we're talking about here, Dr. Tracy Rocket and Mr. Jim Roach. So Tracy, besides having the coolest name in the college, is a professor of management practice here in the Neeley School. She's an award-winning teacher, award-winning speaker, a very sought-after consultant. She's an expert on teams. She has a lot of expertise also in diversity, equity, and inclusion kinds of issues, as well as expertise in negotiations. So Tracy, glad that you're here. Jim and his team head up executive education here at Neeley. Many of you might know him through other programs that you've been a part of. But Jim came to Neeley with 25 years plus of executive experience in managing organizations and teams, and in consulting for the management of organizations and teams. He led Verizon's organizational effectiveness consulting team for over 10 years, focusing on business transformation and the like. But he does a lot of teaching in the program, as well as leading our exec ed, dealing with team topics, employee engagement, and just leading organizations. So really thrilled to have the two of you here as the panel. And again, audience, I encourage you to submit your questions via the chat box. So panel, I want to start with kind of the big picture here. As I mentioned, the future of work is seeming more near term than maybe it did in the past. But what do you see just when you think about managing people and managing organizations? What do you see as kind of the trends that we are facing in the future? And let me start. Tracy, why don't you start with that, and then Jim, you can pick up.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So we've got a lot of things coming together all at the same time, separate from the pandemic, which was a surprise. So one big thing that I think is going to shift a lot is just generational differences, right? So you're having, the silver tsunami. So a lot of the boomers are retiring, Gen Xers are moving up into management, millennials are moving into management roles. And then you have this whole new Gen Z coming in, which is going to create a lot of opportunities because there are different expectations, different experiences, different perspectives on the way that we do things. So I think that's a huge thing that we're going to be thinking about managing. I think, technology, of course, is big, not just, as we've seen the kind of technology that we're using here today, but AI, VR, AR, they're working right now to have meetings in a virtual reality space. And I think that's going to be something we're doing in a few years, and kind of related to that, climate change is a huge thing that's coming up that we're going to have to start dealing with. And I think businesses are going to start adjusting. And, one way to do that is reducing carbon footprint for travel, getting teams together, that sort of thing. And then, we have things like, the increase in awareness of mental health issues, for instance. And I think COVID really pushed that forward, but people are talking and thinking about that a lot. So I think not just physical health, but mental health is going to be something that organizations are paying a lot of attention to. So Jim, what about you? What do you think?
I think you hit on a lot of really important themes there. The thing I would pick up on is kind of the middle piece there around, what do we see changing in the economic environment, right? So you have, as you just mentioned, AI and robotics and analytics, and a lot of fundamental shifts in how we're going to do work. Michael Sherrod, who's on our faculty here, is a wonderful instructor, and he talks about how do you lead in this age of what really is continuous transformation. And I think that places a lot of pressure on organizations and a lot of pressure on people. There's been a lot written around, okay, how do those factors actually impact work, the work we do, and what do we see in terms of jobs, right? And you get all kinds of perspectives, from the robots are taking our jobs to what is an optimistic picture of the future. And there's a lot written, but Jeff Schwartz just wrote this book. It's called Work Disrupted. Jeff led the future work practice at Deloitte, and it's a really interesting read. Now, of course, he's an economist, so he starts with their take on jobs displaced, number of jobs displaced by the factors that Tracy mentioned, right? And they come up with 73 million jobs displaced, immediately followed by, we think, like other workforce transformations historically, that the future will bring more roles we don't know about yet. And so they estimate 133 million new roles would be created. And so that's a really interesting shift. And economists like to kind of breeze over the transformation that happens at the business level, because that's a major thing and impact people. But they do talk about what do we see at the core of that shift? And the short version is, if we see roles on the repetitive, if the procedures are repeated over, they're common, they're daily, they're routine, and they're standard, those kind of roles are ripe for disruption. And the other point that they'll make is disruption is hitting not just, when we talk about technology and these changes, it's not just hitting manufacturing, it's hitting the legal industry. You have AI that can interpret scans in the medical industry. So you have this difference. What I like about what they've written and what about Michael Sherrod and others say is this distinction for, okay, what will work look like? And they're going to talk about, it's going to place a lot more emphasis on critical thinking, creative thinking. How do you reframe challenges and kind of lead into this unknown space? And that is both optimistic, and I think also, it's a unique and probably pretty big challenge for leaders at a number of levels. Side note on this topic, kind of concurring with them, HBR had a small digital blog today that I thought was well written, and it's called "Why AI Will Never Replace Managers." And it's interesting because it talks about the same skill sets, but I think what we know about those skill sets is they're difficult, and it takes a lot to kind of go through and be able to apply those. So I'd start with that, Mark.
Well, so that kind of sets the macro stage. Those are, I think, are that's a really great list of some huge forces that are going to change organizations and therefore change work going into the future. Before we dive into some more specific topics, I guess I want to hone in on teams. You know, as you think about those forces, what do you think is going to be different about the teams of tomorrow? And again, let's just maybe get a quick reaction to that, and then we'll dive into some specific topics. But Jim, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start, because I think what we see is that I think everyone on the call knows this. There's a significant pressure for organizations to be fast, to be agile, and to be innovative. There's a high pressure. We saw that during our pandemic. We see it now. So I think we see organizations experimenting with structure and with what they're doing with teams, right? So on a macro level, I think we do see organizations shifting to a focus on using teams in a different way, focusing on agile teams with more responsibility, and giving them significant organizational challenges to work on. I think the other thing we see is this decoupling of resources from the organizational hierarchy. And what I mean by that is things we've seen in the software industry and aerospace and defense for years, where resources come together to solve a customer problem or to work on a specific project, then they reassemble to do something else 2 months later, 3 months later, whatever it is. So those resources belong to the organization, not to the individual managers and things like that. So I think one of the things, or two of the things we see in teams, are broader responsibility organizationally, and that's this decoupling of skills and resources from formal hierarchies just to serve the needs of the moment or the needs of the customer.
That's really interesting. There's some pretty cool academic research coming out in marketing and some other areas looking at they use the label temporary organizations, because sometimes it's not only internal people that are being configured around a particular customer thing, but sometimes it involves partners from other organizations that come together as well to deliver some particular solution. So I think that's a really cool topic.
Yeah, it's interesting. And when I was at right before coming to TCU, as a Link Simulation and Training in Arlington, and of course we managed our programs exactly that way, with a homeroom of about 800 engineers and scientists and program managers who came together, dispersed, in some of the things and the pressures it puts on teams is kind of interesting, but also can be a significant advantage.
Yeah. So Tracy, again, thinking about some of these big macro trends that you all identified, and then thinking specifically about teams, any thoughts on the biggest changes on teams?
So I want to kind of go back to a little bit of what Jim was talking about, because there's actually a term for the team you're talking about, this collection that kind of shifts and moves. It's called a sand dune team. And we used to talk about them almost more theoretically, like you saw it in the military when they would come together to solve a challenge. They would have the experts come together and then they would disperse, right? But what has happened with the complexity and challenges of today's world, you're seeing them assembled and reassembled all the time now in your common organization. And just thinking about the COVID response, right? Here at the university, how when we had to pivot from being face-to-face to entirely online, how there was this connected campus that they got together, and different people were pulled in from different areas with different levels of expertise. And then when they weren't needed anymore, they moved out and new people came in, right? And I think that's what we're gonna have to do to address these challenges. Having said that, one of the difficulties with sand dune teams is they don't have the typical team structure and time to develop like cohesion and psychological safety and all these things we want in teams. They don't really have team identity in the same way. So I think one of the challenges is going to be having managers come up with new ways to manage this. It's not going to be the top-down management where people are going to get together face to face. These are people that may never meet in person, that have to come together and meet some kind of team goal. So I think that's going to be really important. And I think even just outside of those teams, in our regular face-to-face teams, I think that one of the things managers sometimes neglect in the day-to-day of getting things done, they're thinking about the goals and the tasks of the team, but they don't think about the support and the process of that team. And so I think that managers are going to have to think more critically about how to do that. And one thing that I think we need more of is actually team coaching. And this is something that Richard Hackman had been proposing for like the past 40 years. That we need to be doing this. You have the U.S. women's, soccer team that goes to the Olympics. They all know how to play. Many of them have played together, but they still have a coach that's assigned to help them do what they need to do there, right? Why we don't have coaching for our teams is in organizations is still a bit of a mystery. And so, I'm hoping that this is going to drive more of an interest in getting that team coaching, experts on teams who come in and help managers manage those teams. I think we're going to see an increase in that in organizations.
Well, that's actually a great transition to what I wanted to talk about next. I'd like to pick up on what you were just talking about, and maybe you and Jim then are some coaches for the audience out there. I think most of the people joining today, the really interesting part about this topic today is the focus on teams. I mean, everybody, well, most organizations, significant amounts of work get done in teams, and I think these topics as kind of the team environment is being disrupted, and then as we look towards the future and these trends that you talked about, the world of teams has changed. And so you talked about these people might never meet each other. How do you create and maintain culture among people who might never meet each other? They're not on site for any large periods of time. How do you bring newcomers into a setting like that? Can we start with that? Just maybe Tracy, let's start with you. Talk some about how do you build and maintain culture.
It's a challenge, but it's doable. And the first step is don't act as if you don't need to socialize people in a virtual environment. I think that's mistake number one. It's like, we see it as virtual, we're doing all our work virtually. We don't have to worry about socializing, and we don't have to worry about making connections because we're just focused on the task. And so one is just actually a realization we need to be doing something. Two is create those opportunities for socialization. So having people come together, even if they're never in the same room, with the technology, right? Having people meet via Zoom, because that's such an important way, seeing people's faces. We're very social creatures. We need that connections with others. And so having us get together in these, virtual spaces, not to get work done, but to know one another, right? To spend a little bit of time sharing that kind of information you share when you're around somebody day to day, right? So having dedicated time for what they call a virtual water cooler, where people just get together and have those conversations, right? I know people are so done with things like Zoom happy hour and everything, but I still think those sorts of places, particularly if you have a built-in agenda and program. Like, one of my favorite things was I heard somebody's organization had a taco party online, and what they all did was they got recipes and they cooked together as a team, and they made their tacos and they reviewed them at the end. They had such a blast doing this. It was a really good memory for them. And you don't have to do this every week, right? I mean, you do this once every 6 months or whatever, once a year. But then when you have the day-to-day face-to-face online, you spend a little bit of time reconnecting. Hey, how are your kids? What's going on? Versus we have to get right to work, which I think sometimes we see the virtual environment as just the workplace and no social stuff. So
Tracy, if I can I interject there? Because what I'm hearing you saying is it's not just allowing some social time around a work event or just having specifically planned social times. I mean, everybody's busy, but it sounds like you're proposing a kind of a blend of those.
All of it, yeah, because that's what you do in the real world, right? In your physical workspaces, sometimes you go out to happy hour with your colleagues, sometimes you celebrate a birthday party, but when you're in those meetings, usually you spend a few minutes chatting with one another, catching up on things. You see somebody, down the hall, you stop and ask them how their day is, right? So spending a little bit of time doing this in both the dedicated time, but also the time that's work time, I think is important.
Jim, do you have anything to add to that? Managing culture?
Yeah, Mark, I would say, I want to go back to something Tracy said a little earlier, which is paying attention to the process and paying attention to how the teams work, not just the task, is crucial, right? And we used to say that's a competitive advantage. And I don't think that's ever been more true than it is today because of the complexity of teams, right? I think she's right. Leaders set the tone and they have to carve the time out to focus on the culture. And you get to exactly what you said, socialization and how do you build cohesion, Let's talk about values and operating principles. I think storytelling is a big issue. I think you have to tell stories that celebrate successes, and in particular highlight how they happened. So you can focus on the team working together or individual performance or the things that you want to highlight and create the moments to do that. So I think those celebrations are really important. One of the things that strikes me too is, this responsibility of leaders and the focus on people and the individual communication that happens actually is more important and takes more of our time and needs to take more of our time than it did previously. And that's I think a change that we feel. We spent years and years in organizations removing layers and putting more work on leaders. And that is going to get in our way because leaders really need to spend the time, as Tracy said, kind of focusing. How do you create this? The last thing I'll say is this concept of re-onboarding is really interesting to me. And it's this idea that periodically, as she just said, we have to reconnect with folks on all kinds of levels to connect them to our team, the why we do things, and the what they do, and the culture we have.
And I'll just add, some teams, I should say some organizations are doing a really good job of this, right? So I have a former student, graduated in May of last year, went to work in June at a new job, and their socialization process has been great. They're not in the office most of the time. They're still mostly remote, but he is thrilled to be there. He loves it. I contrast that with another student who was in the same class with me, who just sent me an email last week. She left her job at this company she took, big name company that just blew the socialization process. She felt isolated. She felt like she didn't know anybody on her team. They started work basically at the exact same time, but the two organizations just did things very, very differently. And so you have one student who is going to stay for, at least several years. He's very happy. And the other who already left after, a few months. So, this is like Jim said, it's a competitive advantage for companies who are doing this right, particularly for recruiting and retaining.
So I'm having fun jotting down great terms I'm learning today. Sand dune teams, re-onboarding. These are awesome. I'm making a good list here. So I want to ask a kind of a related question to what we were just speaking about, and that is how to motivate a workforce that is either partially or fully remote. I mean, I think in our work here at Neeley over the last year, I think people really have we've dived in to really try to make the best of the situation. But over time, I get a sense of there's a bit of, whether you call it Zoom fatigue or whatever that kind of comes in. And I think this is not restricted to Neeley, but I think in a lot of organizations, people kind of get tired when there's not the human connection, and working elbow to elbow. Motivation maybe becomes a factor. What are your thoughts on that, Jim? Maybe let's start with you on that, and then we'll go to Tracy.
Sure. I think some of the things that we would have said about motivation and engagement remain true, and maybe to Tracy's point, just need more focus, right? So I think it's always been true that employees need to know why. Why is it important? Why do I find it important? Why does the customer find it important? And why do we do what we do? You can point to, we have partners in executive education across a lot of different industries will tell us about the why they do things, and being able to articulate that very well to their employees during the pandemic gave them a lot of focus and a lot of resilience through what was a very and remains kind of a difficult time for a lot of folks. I think the other thing that we see is employees really want autonomy. They want to work on things that are important to the organization and that are important to them. And they'd like to be able to control their jobs, right? They want to be able to also have autonomy over where they work, how they work, and when they work. And I think those things are highly engaging, especially in virtual or hybrid environments.
Yeah, I would agree with the autonomy, particularly generationally. I think millennials and Gen Zs, they value autonomy. They value purpose. That's another thing that's really motivating to them. They want to be at a company that has values that align with their own. And one of the things that I found that happened with, the onset of pivoting was a lot of managers clamped down. Like, they were very worried that their employees weren't doing what they needed to be doing. And even though all of our research shows that from decades that remote employees are actually more productive on average than face-to-face employees, they got nervous. And many of them started micromanaging, which is not the same as over communication, checking in with your people. This was like, making sure that people were keeping a log of what they were doing and where they were. Some companies installed tracking software on their employees' devices. That's completely demotivating. And I would say, do not do that, because that runs the risk of turning people off and losing them. And so I think that, having that connection with your employees so that you can trust they're doing what they're doing. And I'm not saying don't hold people accountable. I'm just saying, give them the goals. And if they don't meet them, then that's a discussion you have. I think another thing too that I found was really motivating was, and I heard stories about and read about a lot, was leaders modeling vulnerability, right? So, coming in and saying, I'm exhausted because I've got 3 kids and 2 of them are at home and I'm having to teach them and do all this. I know you guys are stressed too, and, thank you for helping me, right? Like just that little bit of human touch that leaders put into saying that we're all in the same boat really help motivate employees. And I think that employees respond really well to that.
So audience, I want to pause here for just a minute and encourage you to submit any questions or thoughts. I mean, I'm taking a lot of notes here and we're hearing really great information, but if there's something specific that comes to your mind that you'd like to follow up on or a different direction you'd like us to go, please feel free to type that in there. Peggy, are you seeing any questions in the chat box right now that I've missed? Okay, but please audience, would love to have your input on that.
Mark, I'm actually seeing some come through. This is Kaylin. I just had a question sent over to us. We're going to backtrack a little bit. And the question is, could you unpack the Sand Dune team a little further? Do you see this as a matrix type team function, like dedicated teams in resourcing?
Yeah, it is in some ways a little bit matrix-like. It doesn't have a traditional structure in the same way that you have, a stable team lead and they assign all the work. A lot of times leadership will shift along with the needs. And so you can think about like challenges that this has been used in the past in like big complex challenges in which one team couldn't like come together and solve it. So one good example is like the Chilean mining disaster, when they had to have people, come together from all kinds of different organizations. People came from obviously from the government and from academia and engineering in Chile, but they also came from the US and from Europe, and they were having to organize and focus on different things, right? And so there were kind of different buckets that they were trying to address. So one was trying to, figure out how to drill down and get the people out. Another bucket of concern was trying to keep the people alive, the miners alive, and what they had to do that. And then another one was actually focused on how to kind of deal with them psychologically. Like you could keep them alive, you could send them food and water, but how did you deal with the psychology of being trapped in the mine? And so what happened was, as this team sorted and resorted as things became more and less important, right? And then, when you shifted the focus from, okay, well, how do we feed them, to how to deal with their psychology and the stuff they're concerned with, like the focus shifted to that team. And sometimes they call in new experts as needed, that sort of thing, right? So there was no one clear, I am the leader, I am telling the team what to do. The team comes together, kind of puts things together, and then the team just dispersed. Like these people don't work together anymore, right? And you saw this with pandemic response and that sort of thing, but also, just these day-to-day challenges. I've got a new client who's coming to me with some problem that I can't solve on my own. So I'm going to ask a couple of people from other areas to come in and help me solve that. And then, a couple of us may stay together and keep working on something, but people may peel off as needed. So, and because of the fact that we have shifting alignment, but also we don't necessarily have all the same goals, the challenges of managing this team become even greater in terms of who gets priority, for instance, or who gets to have the say. And so these are very real challenges that teams today are having to deal with. And again, you just see this in our organizational teams, I think a lot more now. And also, to be frank, a lot of the reasons why we have these sand dune teams is because we need expertise that we don't have where we are. And that expertise is not necessarily next door either. It's very often out somewhere that an organization we're not affiliated with, that we have to get some resources from and bring that to it. And so it's kind of like, Mark said, we almost create a new organization for a temporary piece of time.
Well, thanks for unpacking that a little bit. Okay, so another really cool question just came in, and this relates to our discussion related to culture. The question is the company culture or the generation's culture more important? Stated differently, does Gen Z or the gig economy care about your culture? Jim, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, sure. So I think the answer is they all end up being important, right? But what I would say about it is the way I think about it is concentric circles, right? So I would start with the culture that's probably most important is the one that they experience on the team, where they spend their most of their time, because that's what they'll experience as the real face of and the real feel for any organization that they're in, is the team where they spend that time. It's nested in potentially a department culture and an organizational culture, but the tone that the leader sets and really responsibility for that culture on the team is actually distributed to the whole team. That's another thing to think about. It kind of dovetails with what Tracy said. But I think, Gallup, Korn Ferry, and others would estimate that the way you experience climate on a team, 70% of that is created by your direct supervisor. Of course, that varies across industry to industry and organizations, but the most felt sense is going to be the culture that's created on the team. So that's where I would start. And importantly, that's where the leader, all of us, have the most control.
But so a follow-up to that, and this was another question that just came into the box. What about if you're managing a team, you're somewhere kind of in the middle of the organization, and there's a senior management level that may not care quite as much about culture as perhaps you do? I mean, perhaps you see the value in kind of building this team culture and sharing values and getting people to buy in. Any tips for how to influence those above you, or how to care about culture, or any tips for trying to build culture within an organization that doesn't necessarily have a strong corporate level culture?
I'll jump in and I'll let Tracy rescue me here. But actually, that's a familiar topic. I spent, as you mentioned earlier, years with an internal consulting group, and we saw that all the time. That is a frequent problem. I think what is interesting in different organizations is success gives you leverage to do a number of things and influence people in a different way, right? So the first thing I say is focus on doing the things you think are right and success in your team. And then, as some of our colleagues will talk about, how you influence in organizations is thinking about stakeholder mapping and influencing leaders above you, not just directly, but with others in the organization. And Michael Sheard actually teaches a course, it's on coalition building, and it speaks the language of how do you find a point of success, multiply that success probably first at your level, and then bring that to a higher organizational level. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to, depending on the leader, is to involve them directly without letting them to run the show, which can be a little difficult, but I've seen that work as well.
Tracy, let me pose the next question to you. This is a great question that came from the audience. Perhaps we've talked a lot about teams that are remote because of the pandemic and some of these current forces. But a lot of organizations have global teams that are remote just by the nature of where people are located geographically. Do you see kind of parallels between the two? Are the things we're learning in one domain transferable, to the other?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a lot of experience with virtual teams already. If we think about organizations and their global teams, right? Many organizations have been having global teams for a decade or more with almost no physical meeting at all. And so I think that there's some really good lessons we can take from those teams and apply to our hybrid teams or to our virtual teams that are here because of remote work. And one of those, I think that we've just learned over time is how important communication is. And Jim kind of touched on this earlier, but you almost can't communicate enough with people who are remote, right? Because there just is this there's a vacuum of information, and you don't absorb things in the same way when you're reading an email as when somebody's telling you. And we get our signals crossed if we're not in the same workplace and we're not there from 8 to 5 every day. And virtual teams, international teams, we've learned really have to spend a lot of time and be very intentional, because not only do they have the challenge of the virtual, but they also have the challenge of different cultural norms and expectations, right? And so we know in virtual teams that spending time talking about what does a deadline mean? What does the deadline look like? Who is responsible for what? Being really, really explicit about that, versus when we tend to be more implicit in these face-to-face meetings. Those things follow and work exactly the same way in our remote teams. And we've been talking about remote and we've been talking about face-to-face. Let me just say hybrid is actually what we're going to see more and more of. And in some ways that's even more challenging, because then you have the out of sight, out of mind problem, right? And that's a particular challenge. So I think that you can almost structure this as like the intentionality of the norms and the roles, the communication, agreeing upon expectations, all those things that are absolutely critical for these new teams.
Are there any best practices for ensuring that, like, let's say it is a hybrid team, perhaps the remote people feel a little bit left out because the in-person people, something comes up quick, I can run over to your desk and say, hey, Tracy, what do you think we should do about this? And we make a quick decision without, integrating the rest of the team. Any best practices to keep remote members of a hybrid team from feeling left out?
Yeah, one is just spending that time one-to-one with all of your employees. So you give some time one-to-one with your in-person employees, reach out to your remote employees and get in touch with them at least once a week on the camera, saying, hey, what can I do? What do you need? That sort of thing. That's really important for just building that relationship in part, but also kind of capturing what's going on, because you're remote. So you're probably not going to tell me you have a problem by email. But if I get you in front of me and say, hey, tell me what's going on. Are you having challenges? How are things going with, having your spouse or partner at home while you're, working, and those sorts of things? Having those check-ins are important. And I think, like Jim said, it takes more time, right? It's not easy to do, but it's not fair to the remote employees to give that space to the face-to-face employees. So you've got to carve out that time intentionally, and they need to be one-to-one, not these group, hey, how's everybody doing? Because people aren't going to reveal if they need something or if they're facing a challenge.
I'm really glad you brought up the one-to-one thing. I mean, it kind of addresses a question that somebody just posted about if the socialization with online people is always in a group. There are some things I think people don't feel comfortable sharing, and it's also different from an in-person social hour where Jim and I might stand in the corner and talk for a few minutes, privately, and then I might go talk to somebody else, privately. I guess as I'm thinking about, tips for actually doing that. So you're saying that leaders and team members just have to be very intentional about setting up these one-to-one opportunities.
Yeah. And I would say just make it a routine. Every Friday from 2 to 4, I'm going to have like 15-minute check-ins with my people. Right. And then obviously, like, don't wait until Friday. I mean, Monday you can check in with people via email or that sort of thing, but that's dedicated, carved out time, and don't make it optional, right? It's not come and see me if you have an issue, because people aren't going to come and see you, right? That virtual office hours as a professor were a failure. Nobody came to see me. But if I reached out and tapped a student that I felt needed something, I was able to get a response. What I would suggest is you go further than that. You don't tap out and reach, I don't reach out to you, Mark, because I think you're struggling. I reach out to you because I'm reaching out to you and to Jim and to Kaylin and to Peggy every single week, and having that touch base, because you may seem like everything's fine, but you may have something you need some help with.
So I am struggling, so please reach out. All right, thanks. So Jim, let me come to you with the next question. A question that was just posed online, and it kind of maps some notes I was making ahead of time of things we might want to talk about. We're in a setting now where companies are varying in their policies about whether they're requiring employees to come back to work. And there's a number of anecdotes that we're hearing in the business press about employee retention in situations like this. Perhaps a company that has a more flexible policy is able to actually, steal some talent away from a company that has rigid policies. Can you have some thoughts on just the whole management of retention, trying to get, it's important to have people together for culture, but wow, tough issue.
It's a tough issue, right? I mean, to your point, some of the studies that I read suggest that if you require everybody to come back to work, up to 42% of your workforce is going to look for another job. Like that's a really high number,
Yep.
right? At the same time, if we were to kind of dial back pre-pandemic and we look at studies on what generates innovative ideas and where do we see great teams, and Google and others did these studies, you would find they suggested that in-person, intact teams have a slight advantage, right? Complicated by the pandemic, and we just proved we all can work remotely. So you have this intersection of some tough issues. My own opinion is this. I think that Tracy's spot on. I think that leadership and communication are going to make the biggest difference here, because as you look at this issue, it's complex. There are some jobs that have to be done in person. There are some jobs that are better done in person. And of course, there's a lot of work that can be done remotely. I think as you approach that issue, you have to decouple some things. And one of the things that I see as kind of a barrier to some of this stuff is just, and Tracy alluded to this, but it's really the operating principles of leaders, right? Business necessity and managerial preference aren't the same thing. So it's depending upon how you would prefer to work. And managers are really good at projecting their preferences for how they like to work, whether it's in person or not, onto their employees. We started with what motivates folks, and we said autonomy. And I think autonomy within the context is what does the business need? What do the customers need? My experience would say that 95% of the time, employees can come to the right conclusion for what is required to successfully do their jobs. And that's where I'd lean. I would lean on shifting as much autonomy for that decision within a frame and a context for what are we trying to accomplish to the employees. Requiring, there was a great HBR article about some healthcare systems that obviously said, look, we have to be here. But the process that they went through to get there laid out the communication kinds of things that Tracy just went through. They were very, very focused on their culture. They started with what do we value and why do we value that? How does that translate to patient healthcare outcomes? How do you contribute to that? And you get to this conclusion, gosh, we need to be here to do this. But it was a deliberate process with some exemptions and some other things. So that's how I start.
Tracy,
Yeah.
you have thoughts?
I totally agree, and I think the statement you made about managers tend to project their desires on their employees, right? And I think I read that exact same thing. 42% said that they're not going to go back if they're required to be back in the office full time. 70% of organizations are saying they're going to go back fully, in person. There's this real mismatch, and I think you have to consider the business needs, right? You can't ask a surgeon to work remotely, right? I mean, very clearly, a surgeon has to be present, but there are a lot of jobs that don't require much presence or require a little bit. Toyota, for instance, looked at all their jobs and they've kind of assigned jobs to classes. So have to be there all the time, have to be there, halftime, have to be there like quarterly, and can be fully remote, right? And then I think asking people what they want is really critical, because I think, again, making those assumptions that I like to work half time in the office and half time out, therefore my employees would like that. And what I found surprising was I read an article just last week that found the survey did it. It was Wall Street Journal or New York Times, I can't remember. They found that roughly only like about 30% of employees wanted to be fully remote. That was a small number. And only about 30% wanted to be hybrid. 40% wanted to be back in the office at all times, right? And so, just talking to people, because if I'm suggesting to you can stay at home and you really don't, that's not what you want. I'm not matching. I'm not giving you that autonomy. I'm not matching your preferences, and you're likely to go find some place that will give you that opportunity. So I think doing the business analysis and then talking to employees and seeing what they want and seeing where you can match people within those.
So one other question I want to ask. So by the way, if people are kind of watching the clock, I'm going to be respectful of your time, and I'll make sure that we're out of here by 1 o'clock. I'll leave a few minutes at the end just for some wrap-up comments. But question I want to ask, and then there's a really great kind of wrap-up question that came in through chat. But just briefly, I think we should touch on change management efforts. You know, managing change is a difficult thing in the best of times. You know, when you've got a cohesive culture and everybody right there working together, managing change is tough. Any thoughts on how, you know, kind of a remote team environment affects your ability to lead a change effort? Yeah, I stumped them.
Yeah. It's an interesting question because, I mean, I think some of the stuff works the same in either environment, right? Like Jim talked about, like starting with why, right? Talking about why we're doing this. One of the places I think that it gets harder is doing that work of talking to people and getting their points of view, right? And I think kind of almost the empathy piece of change management, where I try to understand like what your point of view is and where the gap is between the change I want to make is and what your expectations are. And I think sometimes because we're virtual and we're out of sight, out of mind, we don't think about doing that piece. And I think that piece is really, really important. So I would say making sure that you're actually connecting with people to get that buy-in versus just, this is how we're going to do it. And then also the other piece Jim mentioned, I think is really even more important in this environment is storytelling, right? The storytelling around why we're doing this, celebrating the successes, the things that are working, that sort of thing. Again, a little bit harder virtually, but can be done. You just have to be very intentional about it.
Yeah. And Mark, I would say she's spot on. I mean, I think that leadership style will go a long way to try to address this. And if you think about authentic leadership, humility, she mentioned vulnerability earlier, and I think that's spot on. How do you create the psychological safety so people can disagree, talk about what's important to them as you lead change, talk about how they might see it differently, so you can build cohesiveness and create a coalition to kind of change things, is harder. And as she mentioned earlier, you have less time to do it. So you have to focus on it and try to get it done up front.
So one of our attendees is getting ready to step into a new leadership role at a new company. And I think the question I'm going to ask could also pertain to someone who's, you know, staying within the same company, but being put in charge of a new team. What's your single best point of advice for success as a remote leader leading a team, as a new remote leader coming in to lead a team?
Well, I guess I'll jump in real quickly here. I guess the first thing I would say is be open, ask a lot of questions, and listen intently. I would start with that. I mean, you're going to come in with some great ideas and walk into a team, whether, you know, if you're walking into an intact team who's already had some success, they're going to have a lot of great ideas, right? So it's about listening, understanding where they are, what they can contribute, where they want to go with that. And collectively thinking about, how do we take this to the next place? How do we take this to the next level?
Yeah.
Tracy, any thoughts on that? I mean, because it's kind of this balance between, I mean, Jim, I think your advice about listening maybe is a way to inoculate against micromanaging or like over communication that Tracy mentioned. That was an observation somebody raised in a question. Go ahead, Tracy.
Yeah, I think just spending some time getting to know your team. So listening to them, you know, in terms of the work, but also listening to them in terms of you know, the other side of things. You know, people come to, you know, the workplace as full human beings. So getting to know them. And I think also modeling what you expect, because people do look to leader, particularly when there's a new leader. This is a great time to create new norms in teams. Because people are already expecting change, right? They're not going to be as resistant to it. So if you want to have a new norm where you're meeting with your employees, you know, you have a group meeting and then you have one-on-ones, start off from the very beginning with that norm and set that norm early and stick to it. If you want to have a norm where everybody's camera is on, you know, create that norm up front, ask for people to do it, you know, talk to people who, and I'm not saying you can't have exceptions, but you know, if that's an expectation, and I actually think that's really important for building team cohesion as cameras on. I think it's very hard to connect with people when you can't see them. And so, you know, those sorts of things, setting that stuff up front and role modeling the things that you expect from your team are important.
Sounds great. Well, so great insights. I really appreciate the insights that both of you have shared. And I know, given the range of topics we've talked about, we could keep going for probably a couple of hours. But is there one final thing that you would like to share with the audience? I mean, just as you were thinking about what you might want to share during today's session, I'd like to give each of you a minute or so to kind of deliver a closing comment or one final thought, maybe of a topic we haven't talked about so far. Tracy, would you mind kicking us off?
I have something that I was just thinking about the future work, and I didn't talk about this at the very beginning, but this is a good place to talk about it, which is, when we think about work, we're talking about more about diversity, right? And diversity in work. And I think we tend to narrowly define diversity in some particularly constrained ways through gender, race, age, that sort of thing, right? One thing I think is going to become more of an issue and really impact the future work is neurodiversity. So, I'm thinking about, autism, dyslexia, ADHD. I also think that another area that's going to become really prevalent, and I'm seeing more and more of this with long COVID cases, is disability. Right. So you're going to have more people coming into the workplace who have what we call these invisible chronic illnesses. And, they're people who look fine, but they struggle with chronic fatigue, right? Or they have other issues. And I'm thinking about this very personally because I have a kid who struggles from one that's actually getting more attention in the media because of COVID, POTS. And he's always going to struggle with extreme fatigue. He passes out if he stands too quickly. He needs some accommodations, right? I think all these issues of accommodations with both these neurodiverse issues and these disabilities are going to become more and more important. And it's going to be incumbent on managers to help people meet their needs. And I think, though, frankly, the technology is going to help us in that way, right? Because you don't have to be at an office from 8 to 5. You can work from home. You can get support, that sort of thing. So I think these are kind of two areas that are going to get a lot more attention. And autism, for instance, already is getting more attention, right? Because we've got more autism than ever. And those individuals offer some unique skill sets for organizations. And so those are two issues I think about.
Great. That's super. Jim, concluding thoughts from you?
Sure. Just to piggyback on something she just said, we talked about motivation and engagement earlier. And the truth of that is that actually happens at the individual level. So as leaders, we have to think about, as she said, talking to everybody one-on-one and thinking about how do you engage them in the role on an individual basis for what's important to them in the role. I think often we get asked, what's the biggest barrier to leading these teams successfully? And I would say that's the mindset of the leader, right? And Tracy alluded to operating principles earlier, and she's spot on. It's how do we think differently about the role of a leader in an environment where we just described how our team's different, and we have to lead for speed, innovation, and agility, right? So you have to think about this differently. It's not a directive, hierarchical role. Several people have used different metaphors, but it's really around reframing. It's around conducting. It's around enabling the organizational system and the team behavior to be successful in this environment. It's a very different thing. You have to rethink, well, how do I measure outcomes? It's not productivity, it's not time and seat, it's literally focusing on outcomes. It's a different, when we think about the training we've had as organizations and leaders, we talk about efficiency. And in this environment, yes, that's important, but there are other things that actually be more important than efficiency. And so it's about reframing how you think about your paradigm for leading in an environment like this. And the final thing I would say about it is one of the things that we read about now, and the financial industry helped us out with some Wall Street Journal front page articles about some requiring you got to be at work and others saying, no, we're going to be flexible. The war for talent is going to heat up, and it's going to heat up on these dimensions for which environments, as Tracy said earlier, where are the places that are doing this well, and we can rethink talent and rethink how we lead them. And I think that's going to be just even more important.
That's just awesome. To add one quick point, I think that this generation coming in, Gen Zs in particular, view leadership very differently than we do, right? I mean, anybody can be an expert, anybody can be a leader. And so we're going to have to shift how we address that.
So today has been the tip of the iceberg, right? I mean, there's been a ton of amazing stuff that we've talked about here, and on this topic, as well as a range of others. Alumni, if you're interested in diving in more deeply, Jim and his team have just a wonderful array of executive education opportunities. On this particular topic, there's a course coming up November 30th through December 2nd. I want to point out, we should give Peggy a big thanks here, but TCU alumni get a 30% discount on Neeley Exec Ed. And so I hope you'll look into the opportunities that are there. Would love to continue to engage with you and help you as you grow through your career. So I want to thank our panelists, Tracy and Jim, for just great insights. I'm going to see if I can put up the little applause thing in my, yeah, there we go, in my box. Join me in thanking them. Peggy, let me hand it back to you if you want to make any concluding comments. It looks like we've got about a minute and a half before our hour is up.
Thank you so much, Mark. And as I said at the beginning, we will send a follow-up email either this afternoon or tomorrow with a link to the recording in case you missed anything, and with information about upcoming opportunities through Exec Ed, and then also our next couple of Alumni Advantage events. So we hope that you'll join us then. Great. Thank you, and everyone have a great day.